A New York appeals court has issued a significant ruling in the ongoing civil fraud case involving former President Donald Trump, denying his request to freeze the judgment pending appeal. The decision means Trump must post a bond worth hundreds of millions of dollars within the coming weeks to proceed with his appeal. The ruling represents a split decision on two central issues before the appellate court: financial obligations and business control. On the monetary question, the court sided with the New York Attorney General's office, rejecting Trump's offer to post a $100 million bond.
Ruling in the civil fraud case involving former President Donald Trump, a New York appeals court denying Trump's attempt to freeze his civil fraud judgment. That ruling means, for now, Trump is required to post a bond for hundreds of millions of dollars in the coming weeks. Our executive editorial producer, John Santucci, joining me now, along with our legal contributor, Shauna Lloyd. So, John, let's just talk about what broke here.
Yeah, so, Kara, this is a very split decision. So two things were at issue here before the appellate court in New York. The first, the money, and then the control of the business. So let's start with the money. On the money, big loss for Donald Trump and the Trump family. What happened here, according to the Court of Appeals that just issued this ruling moments ago, is that Trump is on the hook to put up the bond for this. Now, he had offered Kira to put up $100 million in just the last couple of hours. That was rejected by the New York Attorney General. He said, look, you got to put up more. Court of Appeals agreed with that and said you need to put the bond up now. Now, they didn't specify.
The Attorney General had argued that amount was insufficient, and the Court of Appeals agreed, ruling that the full bond must be posted. Legal analysts note that the financial requirement poses a substantial challenge for the defendant. The bond amount reflects the scale of the civil fraud judgment, which found that Trump and his business entities had engaged in years of fraudulent financial practices. The appeals court's decision on this matter is binding unless further appellate review is sought. The second issue before the court concerned the future management of Trump's business interests. While the financial ruling went against the former president, the court's decision on business control represented a more nuanced outcome.
Off the campaign trail and in court for trial, Donald Trump once again before a judge, this time in New York City for his civil defamation trial. The former president's trial will determine whether he will have to pay former Elle magazine columnist E. Jean Carroll even more cash for defaming her in 2019 when he denied her allegations of sexual abuse. Carroll taking the stand today detailing the assault, saying, quote, "I'm here because Donald Trump assaulted me." The former president actually seated just feet away from her during that testimony. Our senior investigative correspondent, Aaron Kontursky, is also there. He joins us outside Manhattan Federal Court right now. So, Aaron, the judge actually threatened to boot Trump from court. What happened?
He did. Former President Trump, as E. Jean Carroll has been testifying, is making some side commentary that her attorneys say is within earshot of the jury. In fact, when E. Jean Carroll says things, he often shakes his head or mouths that's not true.
The ruling allows certain operational continuities while maintaining the structural oversight mechanisms put in place by the lower court. This appellate decision comes after months of procedural maneuvering in both state and federal courts. The case has generated extensive litigation across multiple jurisdictions, with defense attorneys filing numerous motions challenging various aspects of the proceedings. Each motion has been evaluated on its individual merits, with courts consistently finding that the statutory requirements for bond posting must be satisfied. The practical implications of this ruling are immediate. Trump must now secure the full bond amount through insurance carriers or other financial instruments, a process that requires substantial collateral and carries significant costs. Legal experts estimate that securing such a large appeal bond could cost millions in premiums alone, regardless of the case's ultimate outcome. The Attorney General's office has maintained throughout the proceedings that the judgment amount accurately reflects the financial harm caused by years of inflated asset valuations and deceptive business practices. The appellate court's decision suggests that judges at this level find the underlying judgment sufficiently supported to warrant full security during the appeal process. Constitutional scholars note that the ruling touches on important questions about the intersection of civil liability and political office. While Trump is no longer president, the case's outcome could have significant implications for how courts treat high-profile defendants with substantial financial resources. The appeals court appears to have balanced concerns about access to justice against the need to preserve the judgment's integrity during appellate review. The timeline moving forward is now relatively fixed. Trump has a limited window to post the required bond, after which the Attorney General's office could begin enforcement proceedings. These proceedings could include asset seizures and other collection mechanisms if the bond is not secured. The former president's legal team has not yet indicated whether they will seek further review of this bond determination. In a separate federal criminal case, a district judge issued a ruling that legal observers are calling a watershed moment in procedural law. The court denied what defense records indicate was the 43rd separate request to delay trial proceedings, but the significance of the ruling extends far beyond the scheduling order itself. The written opinion accompanying the denial marked a departure from previous rulings on similar motions. For the first time in this case, the judge explicitly characterized the cumulative pattern of delay requests as a systematic effort to postpone accountability rather than a good faith exercise of procedural rights. The order noted that dozens of prior delay requests had been evaluated and found insufficient to justify further postponement. Federal courts operate under rules designed to protect defendants' constitutional rights, including adequate time to prepare a defense. These protections exist to prevent prosecutorial overreach and ensure fair proceedings. However, the judge's order distinguished between legitimate requests for additional preparation time and motions whose primary purpose appears to be calendar manipulation. Legal experts say that distinguishing between good faith and tactical delay requests presents one of the most challenging tasks in case management. Early in litigation, judges typically grant requests for additional time to avoid creating reversible error on appeal. A defendant who can demonstrate that inadequate preparation time prejudiced their defense may have grounds for overturning a conviction. The dynamic described in the court's order suggests that defense counsel exploited this protective feature of the system. Each granted request provided additional time and implicitly validated the strategy. Each denied request created an issue for potential appellate review. The cumulative effect, according to the order, was a procedural density that consumed extraordinary judicial and prosecutorial resources without advancing any substantive legal position. The judge's written opinion included language rarely seen in scheduling orders. The court found that justice cannot be indefinitely postponed at the convenience of one defendant, a phrase that legal scholars interpret as a formal finding of procedural bad faith. Such findings carry weight beyond the immediate case, potentially influencing how future courts evaluate similar patterns of motion practice. Most significantly, the order included an explicit warning that future frivolous motions could result in sanctions. In legal terminology, a frivolous filing is one that lacks any basis in law or fact, filed for an improper purpose such as delay. When a judge invokes this standard in a written order, it signals that professional conduct rules may be enforced against attorneys who continue similar practices. The sanctions warning creates immediate practical consequences for defense strategy. Attorneys must now evaluate whether potential motions could be characterized as frivolous, risking financial penalties and professional discipline. This calculation changes the risk-reward analysis for procedural challenges, potentially constraining the defense's ability to file motions that might otherwise be considered routine. The order also established a firm trial date, ending years of strategic ambiguity about when proceedings would actually commence. Legal analysts note that indefinite postponement serves political as well as legal purposes. A case that remains in procedural limbo never produces public evidence, never reaches a jury verdict, and never creates the factual record that might influence public opinion. The transition from procedural abstraction to concrete trial scheduling represents what observers call the most significant practical shift in the case's trajectory. The former president must now prepare for courtroom proceedings on a fixed timeline, with a judge who has explicitly documented concerns about the defense's litigation conduct. The cumulative effect of 43 denied delay requests creates what legal scholars describe as a substantial credibility deficit that will influence every subsequent phase of the proceedings. Federal courts operate on principles of good faith and equitable conduct. Judges extend favorable discretion to parties who demonstrate genuine engagement with the legal process while withdrawing such considerations from those who appear to abuse procedural mechanisms. The documented pattern of failed delay motions now forms part of the official case record. Every future motion filed by the defense will be evaluated against this backdrop of prior unsuccessful requests. When attorneys seek favorable rulings on evidence exclusion, jury instructions, or cross-examination scope, the judge will consider not only the immediate legal argument, but also the broader context of the defense's litigation history. This credibility dynamic operates subtly but powerfully in trial proceedings. A defense team that has established a record of good faith legal advocacy can expect the court to give careful consideration to close procedural questions. Conversely, a team that has been formally warned about frivolous filings faces a higher burden in demonstrating that new requests are genuinely necessary rather than tactical. The psychological and political dimensions of the ruling extend beyond pure legal analysis. The defendant's public image has been constructed around themes of strategic control and timing mastery, qualities that allowed postponement of legal accountability across multiple jurisdictions. The firm trial order disrupts this narrative by establishing that procedural options have been exhausted through judicial determination rather than voluntary choice. The courtroom atmosphere following the ruling reportedly reflected the significance of the moment. Participants understood that the denial represented not merely another scheduling decision, but a structural endpoint to a years-long strategy. The defendant's physical presence in court, ordered by the judge, transforms the case from a political abstraction into a concrete legal proceeding with specific evidence and witness testimony. Perhaps most importantly, the ruling addresses systemic concerns about differential access to justice based on wealth and power. Empirical research consistently demonstrates that defendants with substantial financial resources and sophisticated legal teams experience longer intervals between charging and trial than less affluent counterparts. These disparities enable resource-intensive procedural strategies that can exhaust opponents and delay accountability indefinitely. The judge's explicit statement that justice cannot be indefinitely postponed at the convenience of one defendant serves as a documented rebuke to this disparity. By characterizing the delay pattern as a misuse of process and attaching sanctions warnings to future similar conduct, the court has created a precedent that other judges may reference when managing high-resource defendants in complex litigation. Public opinion research indicates that significant majorities of Americans believe wealthy and politically connected defendants receive preferential treatment in the judicial system. Rulings that enforce uniform procedural standards, regardless of defendant status, serve important legitimacy functions for the judiciary as an institution. When courts demonstrate that procedural rules apply equally to powerful and ordinary defendants, they reinforce foundational principles of equal protection and due process. The evidentiary phase, now set to begin, will test whether the documented reality of the underlying conduct aligns with the public narrative constructed around it. Witness testimony, documentary evidence, and cross-examination will proceed on a fixed schedule, creating a factual record that cannot be managed through procedural delay. Legal observers anticipate that the trial will generate the most significant public evidence yet regarding the conduct at issue in the case. For the legal profession, the ruling raises important questions about the boundaries of zealous advocacy. Defense attorneys have ethical obligations to represent clients vigorously, but also duties of candor to the tribunal and prohibitions against filing motions for improper purposes. The sanctions warning in this case signals that courts are increasingly willing to enforce these professional standards when advocacy crosses into obstruction. The case now enters a phase where substantive legal and factual questions will take precedence over procedural maneuvering. The defense must prepare for trial on the merits rather than continued efforts to avoid trial altogether. The prosecution can present its evidence before a jury without the uncertainty of further scheduling disruptions, and the judiciary can fulfill its constitutional function of adjudicating disputes according to established rules rather than managing endless procedural challenges. These developments collectively represent what analysts describe as a pivotal moment in the administration of justice for high-profile defendants. The ruling demonstrates that even extensive procedural resources cannot indefinitely forestall the fundamental purpose of criminal adjudication, the presentation of evidence, and the determination of guilt or innocence according to law.